Question 71. A quantitative analyst has calculated the mean HPR, holding period return, of 1% for 110 European corporate bonds with a standard deviation of 2%. If the analyst wants to test at a 5% level of significance that the mean holding period return on European corporate bonds is different from 0, which of the following is the most accurate result of the test? So are we going to reject the null, meaning the mean is equal to 0? Are we going to reject the alternative, which is that the mean is not equal to 0? Or are we going to accept the null, or are we going to accept the alternative? In general, right off the bat, rejecting the alternative is normally not lingo that we're going to use. We're either going to reject the null or accept the alternative. So I would kind of be inclined to rule out B and C right off the bat, just as a lingo issue. But let's solve this regardless and show what we're going to do here. So we are going to be comparing our test statistic, which we'll be calculating, to a 5% level of significance, which is going to be a critical value of 1.96. And so essentially, if our test statistic is above 1.96, we're going to reject the null, meaning that in our null is that we're different than 0. So if we're above that, we're different than 0. So that's what we're testing. So this is saying the null is that our corporate bond return is different from 0. So to calculate that test statistic, sample mean minus our hypothesized value. So our sample mean is this holding period return that we have of 1%, and then we're calculating it being different than 0. So that's what we're going to be testing against, which is our hypothesized value. And then in our numerator or our denominator, we have standard deviation divided by the square root of sample size. Standard deviation given at 2%. Sample size is 110 bonds, so we'll take the square root of that. And we work that through, we get 5.24, which is going to be above our critical value, meaning that we will A, reject the null, and conclude that our return is different than 0. Question 72. Which of the following is the correct sequence of steps in hypothesis testing? So rather than reading through all these, I think it's going to be more worthwhile to just pull this in and show the correct sequence here. Correct answer is going to be B, and that sequence is state the hypothesis, B, 2, select level of significance, formulate the decision rule, compute that test statistic, and then make a decision. So this is going to be our sequence, and this type of question is really just going to be a function of memorization. I would recommend putting something like this on a flashcard. On one side you have sequence steps in hypothesis testing, and then you have these 5 steps on the back side, and just committing that to memory is going to be the best way to help you for these types of questions. Answer B. Question 73. An analyst believes that the future 15-year real earnings of the S&P 500 are a function of the trailing dividend payout ratio of the stocks in the index, DB, and the yield curve slope, YC. She collects data and obtains the following multiple regression results. So we have those results from these two variables, the dividend payout ratio and the yield curve slope, and their coefficients and standard errors. Calculate the 95% confidence interval for the estimated coefficient for the independent variable DB. Number of observations, 43. So here's what that confidence interval calculation is going to look like. So our formula here, is going to be pretty straightforward. It's just going to be the beta, or the coefficient of the variable in question. So 0.27 is what we'll plug in there. Then we're going to do plus or minus the t distribution value, which is going to be 2.021, which we're grabbing from our t distribution table. And we're going to grab that for 40 degrees of freedom, since we have 43 observations and 3 degrees of freedom for the number of variables. And then our standard error, which we are also given at 0.029. So this is going to be what we're adding and subtracting from 0.27. And when we do that, we get 0.2114 and 0.3286, which lines up right here with answer B. Question 74. A sample of 200 firms reveals the following relationship between the annual stock return and the average years of experience per employee. So we've got our formula here, an analyst wishes to test the joint null hypothesis that B1 is equal to 0 and B2 is equal to 0 as well at the 10% level of significance. The p-value for the t-statistics of B1 and B2 are 0.12 and 0.11, so they're above that 10% level of significance. Respectively, the p-value for the f-statistic for the regression is 0.09. This implies that the analyst. So when we're looking at joint null hypothesis, what do we do here? Do we look at the f-statistic or do we look at the p-value for these individual ones? Since we're at 10% level, these would be rejected, or these we would not be able to reject the null, but f-stat we would. So importantly, we are going to be looking at the f-stat for a joint null hypothesis. So let's look at these answers and see which of those involves that. So we've got A, can reject the null hypothesis since B1 and B2 are different from 0 at the 10% level of significance. We cannot do that since they're not significant. They're above that 10%. We need to be below that. So we can rule out A. B, can reject the null hypothesis because the F statistic is significant at the 10% level. That sounds correct so far. Like we said, this 0.09 is below the 10% p-value level. So we could reject the null on that basis. Let's make sure we can rule out B and C, however. Cannot reject the null because we have insufficient evidence to prove both B1 and B2 are different from 0 at the 10% significance level. We would be looking at the f-stat to determine that, so we can rule out. And D, cannot reject the null because f-stat is not significant at the 10% level. It is significant because it's below the p-value of 10% at 0.09. Answer B. Question 75. What is the implication of having a variable what is the implication of a variable having a large variance inflation factor, VIF, in a model? A, there is a high correlation between the variable and the other independent variables in the model. That could certainly be correct when we have a high VIF. Essentially what that's telling us is that the model is detecting or has some multicollinearity, which multicollinearity indicates correlation between the independent variables in the regression analysis. So if there's high correlation between those independent variables, that would be indicative of a high VIF. Sounds like A is going to be our answer. Let's make sure we can rule the others out. B, the variables in the model are uncorrelated. That'd be incorrect. That's when they are correlated. And thus appropriate in explaining the dependent variable. This should be low for this to be a proper model. C, there's a need to include more explanatory variables in the model. If we have high correlation between variables in the model, this means we can be getting rid of variables. We likely don't need to be adding more variables. So we can get rid of answer C here. And then D, excluding the variable from the model would have a strong impact on the fitted values from the model. It might not, because what this is telling us is that we have two variables within the model that are highly correlated with one another. So if two independent variables are highly correlated with one another, taking one out shouldn't really have much effect because that one variable remaining should still be helping to predict whatever we're looking at for the dependent variable. So we can rule out D and stick with answer A. Question 76. A model is estimated as, and we have our model here, where, and we have some numbers. I won't walk through all of them. We'll come back to them. And then the question is, what is the value of P x1, x2, so the correlation, given that B hat 1 equals 2.4 such that the model is reduced to. So our original model, we have 2.8 as our intercept, and then we have 2.2 as our B1 hat, or as our B1, and then we have x1 right here. And then in this original model, we also have 1.1 times x2 plus the standard error. But you can see we don't have x2 in that new model. So because we're reducing that model, this is the new B hat. So we essentially need to know, based on this, what's the correlation, so that we need to know this so that we can solve for that correlation. And so because the model was adjusted, we're going to be using the omitted variable formula to solve this. So here's what that looks like. So the new B1 or B hat is going to be equal to B1, the original B1. So we're given that at 2.2. And then we're going to do plus B2 times this omitted variable portion. And so that this is essentially going to be 1.1, which we're given here, and then that reduces, and then that becomes this big thing here. So covariance of xy, or of x1, x2 divided by variance of x1. Covariance then reduces down to, if we drill down even deeper, that becomes correlation times standard deviation of x times standard deviation of x2. And so then here, now we can isolate this correlation variable. We have the correlation in the formula, and we're given all these other numbers. So we have variance of 16 for x1 and variance of 49 for x2. So we'll need to make these standard deviations, and then we'll leave this as variance for here. So here's what that becomes. So we get 2.2 plus 1.1, and then we plug in all these other numbers here, and that's going to be equal to 2.4. And then all we need to do is work through the algebra here, isolate out the correlation, and we see that ends up giving us correlation of 0.1039, which is going to line up right here with answer D. Question 77. A time series is said to be stationary if A, its statistical properties, including mean and variance, do not change over time. That's going to be correct so far, and is a pretty straightforward definition of stationary. Those variables like mean and variance won't change over time if our time series data is stationary. B, its mean, variance, and covariances with lagged and leading values change over time. That's going to be incorrect. If these are changing over time, contrasted to answer A, that means that we're going to have a non-stationary time series. C, its mean remains constant, but variance and covariances with lagged and leading values change over time. These should all be constant, so we can rule out C. And then D, its mean and variance are variables, but covariances with lagged and leading values do not change over time. This answer doesn't really make sense. A is going to be our best answer still here. Answer A. Question 78. Julian Nagelsmann works as a market analyst in Air Fresher Incorporated, a company specializing in the manufacture of room heaters. While modeling the company's sales, he's noticed a quarterly seasonal pattern. Given that his model includes an intercept term, how many dummy variables will he require in order to model the seasonality component? So to model seasonality, we need to look at the frequency of that seasonality. So we're looking at quarterly. So the number of dummy variables we're going to need is going to be S minus 1, and S is going to be the number of time periods in that seasonality. So it'll be 4 time periods for quarterly minus 1, which will be pretty straightforward. It's going to be 3 dummy variables needed here. Answer B. Question 79. A newly employed risk analyst has embarked on analyzing the market risk of a stock in the automobile industry. After scouring the stock's return data gathered over the past 24 months, the analyst estimates the historical volatility of the monthly returns at 5%. Which of the following is most likely correct? The volatility of the annual returns is 60%. The volatility of the annual returns is 17%. The implied volatility of the annual returns is 17.3%, or the implied volatility of the annual returns is 60%. So right off the bat here, the implied volatility, we're looking at historical volatility here. So we're not going to be looking at implied. Implied would be a forward-looking measure, but we're looking at historical. So right off the bat, we could rule out answer C and D. And then looking at A and B here, we need to determine whether that annual vol is 60 or 17.3. So let's do that calculation. To calculate annual vol, it's going to be equal to our monthly vol times the square root of 12. So we're given monthly vol at 5%, and we're going to multiply that by the square root of 12, which gives us 0.1732 or 17.3%. So this is going to be answer B. You would have gotten A if you straightforward multiplied that 5 by 12, which is not how we want to annualize volatility. Answer B. Question 80. Which of the following statements regarding bootstrapping is most accurate? When using the bootstrapping method, A, bootstrapping allows estimating the distribution of a statistic by repeatedly sampling with replacement from the observed data. This is going to be an accurate statement, so it looks like A is going to be our answer so far. Let's make sure we can rule out the others, but A is looking good. B, bootstrapping requires the data to be normally distributed to produce reliable results. That's going to be incorrect. That's actually one of the advantages of bootstrapping. Like it says in answer A, we're repeatedly sampling to estimate the distribution. We don't need there to be a normal distribution. C, bootstrapping is limited to estimating confidence intervals for means only. It can estimate confidence interval for the mean, but it can also estimate it for a lot of other different statistics. It's not beholden to the mean. And D, bootstrapping cannot be applied to small samples because it leads to biased results. It can be applied to small samples, and part of the reason it's effective is because it's doing this technique where it's repeatedly sampling from that small sample size, so it can lead to better results. However, we always need to be careful when we're using small data sets. Answer A.